To get a sense of what Pluto's ingress into Aquarius means, we might need to look back at what happened previously, not only when Pluto was in Aquarius, but also what happened in between times through the other signs, just to see the background theme. We understand that Pluto's ingress through any sign is the beginning of a theme, and that might be a 20-year period of history, which is not really understood until much later. We don't know what Pluto's doing. It's hidden. Very often a very small event occurs, which has enormous implications. And some of those can be identified only when you look back at history. So if we consider the progress of Pluto through the signs over the last 2 of its cycles, we get a sort of sense of where we are in that cyclical process of Pluto. And that will help us understand what Pluto might mean for us when going through Aquarius soon. So go back to the time before the time when Pluto was in Aquarius, around the 16th century. The huge thing that was going on, it was massive, was the most powerful person in the world was being challenged. Now this is the Pope. And first Henry VIII had a go, and then Calvin really made it impactful. So we start with that, where human rights, which is the key issue here, the Catholic Church was not really respecting towards human rights any more than it is nowadays. And so human rights begins a couple of Pluto cycles ago with this thing that Calvin does, and basically he says, I protest. And so the Protestant Church was born. One cycle later, sometime around the 1790s, you had an attempt to usurp the people in power. So the US Revolution occurred during this period of Pluto in Aquarius. So did the French Revolution. Well, that's the 2 biggest revolutions, really, apart from the attempt by Cromwell in Britain to do the same thing that we ever know about. Now, these 2 occurred, both of them, when Pluto is in Aquarius. So that's a real major clue. However, I think the underlying theme is something which is deeper, and that's the issue of human rights. Now, subsequent to Aquarius, we go into Pisces, and we find that institutional power is at issue, I would say. And we have the discovery, shall we say, of tobacco in the Virginias. And that was a very major thing, because that gave rise to American wealth at that very important time. Pluto in Pisces is a little bit subtle. Like the last time when we had Napoleon knocking on the doors of Moscow, in fact, of invading Moscow, he was defeated. Otherwise, we'd all be speaking French, presumably. He was defeated, not really in the normal way, but by the Russian winter. The Russian general Bagration understood that Napoleon could not survive in Moscow in the winter. He didn't have the resources. The supplies were missing. A very subtle point. And this is how Pisces very often kind of operates. It does something which is subtle and intuitive. So the army just got everybody to leave Moscow, burned the place down, and then Napoleon had nothing to survive on and had to retreat. And the winter killed his army. Otherwise, the whole of human history would be different now, or recent history. So that's the Pluto in Pisces period. When it moved on to Aries, you have the pioneers and rulership questions. First, we have the pioneering taking of the Americas, both by the Spanish and the Brits. And then the Brits had a go at taking India, the East India Company. And then a little bit later, well, 250 years later, the Brits again and other European countries were trying to take Africa. So you have this pioneering and rulership spirit going on. And when Pluto went into Taurus, you had the ownership questions and the settling questions occur. So first, in the first period, in the 1600s, Manhattan and New England were taken. And then a bit later, Alaska was purchased, actually. But also during that time, slaves were freed, both in Russia, the serfs, and in America, in Britain first. So that was all to do with property and ownership. The idea that you could own another person was commonplace for thousands of years. And during this particular 20-year period when Pluto was in, it was a bit longer in Taurus, about 30 years, the whole idea of owning another person was challenged. And a great deal of the resources of the world was invested in slaving. So the wealth of the world was suddenly changed from people to land. And we also had the idea in the following sign when Pluto entered Gemini, that it was ideas that had the wealth, the power. And we had in 1665 Isaac Newton developing calculus. Now, for most people, mathematics is like Greek, you just can't understand it, and calculus is the worst of it. But when you actually understand what calculus is, you'll realize what an extraordinary stretch of the imagination it took to develop calculus. It was the birth of modern mathematics, which means everything scientific on the physical plane was born in that time. So that was Pluto and Gemini. And then 1890s, we had Pluto and Gemini again, and we had other things, other ideas come forward, such as cinematography, such as cars and aeroplanes, and lots of foreign language newspapers in America, because you had all those immigrants and stuff. So Pluto and Gemini period is a bit like that. Pluto in Cancer, if you go back to 1671, you have the creation of the two parties, the Whigs and the Tories, party politics, which we take for granted nowadays. That was invented, and that was invented during Pluto in Cancer. Me and you, we and them, us and them, that kind of idea of our tribe and that other tribe over there. Well, that entered the power structure of the world at that time when Pluto was in Cancer. And that created all manner of things, which in 1914, Pluto goes in Cancer again. You have those empires that have been built in the meantime, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these clashed, and you had the First World War when Pluto entered Cancer. Very often when Pluto ingresses into a sign, there's a lot of serious tension brought to the surface. So Pluto goes into Leo, and you had the Palace of Versailles. Before that kind of thing, in the West anyway, the aristocratic class, where there were all of these very important people with all of the wealth, and then there were all the very poor workers who were starving most of the time. That was established really firmly, the sense of the importance of the aristocrat and the unimportance of the worker. That idea was not present so much before then, and that really sort of cemented that, the Leo megalomaniac principle. And we saw that again in 1939, again, another war. And here we had the megalomaniac principle, not so much in wealth, but in the power to make decisions. And you had such major people as Hitler and Mussolini and even Eisenhower and Churchill. They made huge decisions which had horrible implications on people on both sides of the line, because they felt themselves to be the one in charge, the important one, the king, basically, really. And yet, because of the Second World War, you had the development of self, another Leo principle emerging. And previously it was not strong. Previously there was the ruling class and the workers. And yet now the workers said, well, we want to be more so. We want much more of our self-creative identity to be acknowledged, most particularly, of course, the women who, having gone out to work for the first time for many of them in the Second World War, didn't want to go back into the kitchen. So that was a major identification of self as a sovereign principle. That idea is taken for granted now in the West, that we have the right to get what we want if we can, and so on. That wasn't understood until Pluto went into Leo. And it was in reaction to the previous time when it was the aristocrats that said, no, you can't. So we move on to Pluto in Virgo, and we see that this idea of service in the old-fashioned way was kind of slavery, really. That there was not a lot of difference between those two things. And you had the peak period of slavery around, let's say, 1713. And yet, when you come to the next Pluto in Virgo period in 1960s, once again, women are leading the charge here on the development of consciousness. They want to say, look, we're not slaves. And there was a huge amount of energy put into the emancipation of the woman. It'd been around, of course, for many years before. But now in the 60s, it really happened, partly because of the birth control pill. That has changed the whole dynamic about the freedom of women. They're free to do what they want with their own body. A lot of health issues brought to the attention of the public. Then health food shops were invented. But also the microchip was invented in the 1960s, a very Pluto in Virgo little thing that freed everyone by giving them electronic robots in the end. So the freedom from slavery to turn service into something sacred. Now, in the Libra period, when Pluto goes into Libra, you're expecting to find balance of some kind. And in 1731, you had the idea introduced of dieting. We take that for granted too. That was introduced as an idea. And that was the first time that the Quran was translated into the English language. So once again, this kind of polarity between the Christian West, speaking English very often, and the Arabic nations and others who understand the wisdom of the Quran and the whole kind of sense of that the Middle East and that region has its own wisdom and its own very advanced technology at that time, the earlier times, and they were very much more advanced. And we didn't really know about that in the West until the Quran was translated, so that was quite a big deal. Now in the 1970s, another form of balance needed to be brought, and that was in the form of trade. What we had in the early 70s was the creation of OPEC, the oil producing and exporting countries, very much to do with Arab countries where a lot of the oil is. And so the wealth of the world started to be collected in the Middle East instead of America. And that balanced the game quite significantly. So one little piece of legislation bringing together a bunch of countries who were, had nothing in common really much apart from the fact that they produced oil, then they became a power block in the world. And then that was Pluto in Libra. You also had a major sort of shift in how people were relating, partly because of the birth control pill. Women and men started to relate differently. Sexual liberation was a done deal by the end of the 70s, whereas at the beginning of the 70s, it was a bit of a hippie thing that not everybody else did. But nowadays, everybody's up to it, and before the 70s, they weren't. It really changed everything. So then Pluto goes into Scorpio, and we have in 1742 a very sort of unassuming little thing happened that had huge impact, as I mentioned earlier. Canals were started, and by allowing produce to be transferred by water rather than by road, you opened up areas of, in this particular case, England, but this idea transported itself to America. Later, I'll talk about that. As soon as you build canals, then you allow trade to exist between where the items are produced and where they are sold. So here we have the idea of the coal mines in northern England, supporting the factories, therefore creating produce, and then it could go down through the canals and be made available to world markets. Were it not for the canals, that couldn't have been possible. So the wealth from that would not have gone to the north of England. And the north-south divide in England was a really big deal at that time. And I speak of England a lot because England was the centre of the world in terms of trade at that time. Very influential country. We'll speak of America a bit more in the following century. So canals were the first thing. But when Pluto went into Scorpio more recently, in the late 80s, there was a lot of exposures. Certain political secrets had come to light, and most particularly the church was seen to be abusing its people. And this rocked the foundations of both institutions, church and politics. And the church hasn't recovered yet. It may never do that. It is seen that there have been horrible things going on, and they were a secret until Pluto entered Scorpio, and then they were exposed. More exposures have followed, and there's this general principle that those people in wealth and powerful positions were getting away with literally murder and other horrible things, and now there's a more sort of sense that we understand that that's going on, and there's not so much you can get away with, and that's after the Pluto and Scorpio ingress. Now, when Pluto enters Sagittarius, if we go back to the time of 1760, well, that's called the Age of Enlightenment, and this whole sort of Sagittarius principle of philosophy and knowledge and religious development and sort of expanding the psyche, the ninth house kind of action of learning at the higher level, Sagittarius principle, was absolutely there during the 18th century with the Age of Enlightenment. And interestingly, through the 90s, you had this similar thing happening where everyone was going to workshops and groups, and we were all waking up to different ways of seeing things and opening up a very commonplace activity of spiritual development. It became normal for people in the corporate sector to be going to workshops and be using phrases like yin yang in business meetings and so on. And that was the Pluto and Sagittarius thing. Now, Pluto in Capricorn, 1764, that was when the Brits taxed the USA, a colony, and that led to the Boston Tea Party, where the Americans said, no, we're not paying that, which led to the American Revolution eventually, a bit later on. So this whole idea of trying to impose power and being greedy about that, being materialistic about that, that theme was repeated in 2008, where you had the subprime lending fiasco. And once again, the corporate structure collapsed, basically, because of being too greedy. You know, the use of money as a device of power is common in these two examples. And the banking system basically collapsed in 2008, and it has led to the circumstances which we now have, which give rise to the possibility of the Pluto in Aquarius era being one of radical change in defense of human rights.